So it was really interesting yesterday, and I thought I'd bring this up because it came up yesterday, talking about the resurrection. Went to my wife's grandfather's funeral yesterday. He was 96 or 7 or something like that. And he was a Mormon. So it's really interesting listening to how they talk about the afterlife and all that kind of stuff. So I was kind of like really listening to what they did as far as talking about that stuff. And it was interesting that they did talk about the resurrection. I mean, that was like one of their key points, is like, hey, we're going to live again and all this kind of stuff, and you'll have another body again. So from that point of view, it sounded very orthodox to Christianity as far as the way we view it. So I thought that was really interesting, that listening to them, that, and try just to put all the other stuff out of the way, because they would make a couple of statements. And I was like when he was trying to explain salvation, Jesus came to make it so that you can be a good person and earn your way into heaven, was basically what he was saying. Which, if you know anything about Mormonism, it is very much works-based. So there's little things like that was sprinkled throughout what they were talking about. But it was interesting because I was very much listening to it, and I didn't get a chance to talk to the guy because I actually wanted to go talk to him about what his view on the resurrection was, because I only could get what he was saying about the afterlife. So it was really interesting. And
do they believe in soul sleep, by God? Or like witnesses, or until, because witnesses also they believe you disappear,
right,
go out of existence, and then you're remembered by God and brought back into a new, shiny new body, which looks much better than the one we have and lasts much longer.
I don't know what their view was on that. I didn't ask about that. That's a good question to find out. Now I have something to ask when I find one. I'll corner them and ask, okay, so between now and then, what happens? It'll be an interesting view. But at least, even just from this class, you may think, well, this is more of a class that you would talk with atheists with. But really, you could talk to Mormons about that. You could talk to anybody about this. Which one of the questions was, and I don't know if anybody did their homework, but did anybody look up what Christians mean when they say resurrection? Did anybody do that homework? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
I can tell you what this guy says.
Oh, wow.
Nobody? Well, Don, you want to? Or you, okay, I'll let you.
He can do it.
On resurrection is to occur when Jesus returned on the last day, when everybody gets resurrected, but the believers first unto a resurrection, eternal life, and then the unbelievers unto a resurrection of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what I know.
Okay. When we say resurrection, what else would we mean by that? Just so to be clear, because if we're talking to someone and they ask us about that.
Sometimes you'll see or listen to a kind of careless pastor at a funeral service, and in order not to complicate things about the good brother or sister that's died, they approach the issue as though at death you are resurrected to another life in heaven. In other words, if they skip over the whole intermediate state and launch into heavenly life forever. The reason I thought it would be interested, then again, I didn't think anyone would do their homework. I thought it might be interesting, I should say, to define the resurrection, because N.T. Wright, who is probably the greatest believing Bible scholar of our day, period, end of report, bar none, except maybe James Barr, who was also on a level with him. Okay, I can't say bar none. So the phrase he uses constantly when he talks about resurrection is life after death. So to use my friend Thomas's doubting glasses, if we look at the mission, for example, this is death. This is, may I? Sure, man. You can participate. And this is life after death. And this is the resurrection. This is the intermediate state. You see that? death. The immediate state, we enjoy the peace of God. We're in His hands, according to the book Wisdom of Solomon. So every Second Temple Jew believed that we were in the hands of God, enjoying peace, but not quite complete life. We were kind of in a spirit mood. But contrasting us with Platonism, the formula that Plato popularized in his day, and Alexander the Great popularized even more with the power of the sword and his military victories everywhere, Platonism was quite contrasted with the resurrection, concept of the resurrection. So though Christianity agrees with Plato that the soul escapes the body to be in the hands of God, as you might term it, deem it, but there is a resurrection of the body. This is a disembodied state, and this is a bodied state. So we're going to get a body back, and it's probably not going to live in heaven, because bodies don't seem appropriate for heaven. So probably we will be living with these bodies. I'm open to discussion on this, of course, but we probably will be living in the earth forever, on a perfected earth, in a perfected body.
You're still a JW.
No. I think that's what N.T. Wright teaches. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to use your glasses anyway. Right. Okay, I'm going to leave those there for whoever owns them.
It's I think one thing to look at it, and N.T. Wright also in his book, he had one little simple phrase that I thought was the best, and it's a reversal of death. It's a reversal of death. Now, this is in stark contrast from transmigration or reincarnation. Now, reincarnation, which a lot of the Eastern religions are going to focus in on, and that is, and a lot of the New Age stuff that has kind of been imported into the Western world, and that is you die, you come back again, you have a new body, and you're living again, but that is not your final state. And you continuously do this until you've reached a state of nirvana, or you've joined the great unconsciousness in the sky, or whatever it is. You just continue on that path. And so it is, in a sense, in the whole goal of like Buddhism and stuff like that is to escape that endless cycle, right? Is to get out of that.
And ignore Hebrews 9:27.
Right. It's also very much like the Neoplatonist or Platonist view, and that is that and even the Gnostic view, which was similar to Plato's view on this, and that was that the physical body was bad and we needed to escape it. And so even reincarnation, that does have this thing that if you're talking to someone from the Eastern religions, they may say, well, that's a lot like reincarnation. So they're not going to, they're going to think we're talking the same thing. We're not talking the same thing, because we're talking about a restoration of what it was before the fall, where Adam and Eve lived. You know, where they had work and they lived in the garden and all this other stuff, and they lived without sin. They had the ability to live on for as long as forever, whatever that means. And we're going to be restored to that. So we get once to live, and this is very important because the Bible says, for man is appointed once to live and to die, and then the judgment. So we only get one chance at this. Once we get past this and we enter into the intermediate state, which, you know, there's a lot of debate on that, you know, exactly what is it like, where is it at, what's Abraham's bosom, and what does that all have to do with anything. We know that there's an intermediate state where we're with God for some period of time. We don't know what exactly that means, right? I'll tell you this much, a lot of Christians have a lot of pictures in their mind where you're sitting on clouds and there's little cherubs shooting arrows and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, playing harps and all this stuff. That's very pagan symbolism. It's not really a Christian view. The Christian view being more like what Jesus said, you're with a group of other believers, with Abraham's bosom, whatever that means. Christ went there, and is he still there? Did he take them out? Are they in a new place? What is different? We do know that at death there is a separation between the good and bad, and a chasm that they cannot cross. We know that much. I mean, taking from the parable what Jesus says. And like Don says, then there is at the end of time a resurrection, our resurrection. which Jesus Christ's resurrection is evidence that our resurrection is going to happen. And we get reunited with a new body. Different than the resurrection of Lazarus in the book, because Lazarus, as far as we know, died again. This resurrection is going to be for the new heavens and new earth. And you notice, especially in the book of Revelations, it talks about a new heavens and a new earth. It doesn't talk about a new heavens, so you're not in a disembodied state. That is not the Christian message. It is a message of restoring us to what Adam and Eve had, bringing us back to that position, not to a new position that's, we're all floating around in clouds. That was influenced in a lot of the early Christianity in that Platonism, that view that was there. And it was considered heretical back then, but the church was like, they didn't fight very hard against it. They figured, well, we don't need to worry about that. We got other bigger fish to fry. We have to worry about these Gnostics and all this other, stuff going on out there. And so they really never focused into it. So a lot of them got put into the artwork, and you'll see it in chapels and stuff like that. So a lot of this notion that when you die, you just go to heaven and you're disembodied forever is incorrect. But that's a lot of what people think in their minds. Now, if you go to Bible school and all this stuff, they're going to tell you, well, this is all wrong. But again, a well-meaning pastor at a at a funeral, just not to offend anybody, will just say, well, they're going to go to heaven, and that's all good.
Then you might look at even Sistine Chapel almost as a cartoon of what happens and what is going to happen. Their depicting of heaven is childish. It's okay to have a funny book, but realize that it's just a popularization, and it's not. No serious Christian scholar would give that a second thought. It just breaks down all the time.
Right.
The representations are incorrect and inadequate.
And that's why I wanted to make sure that we understand, one, that idea that I talked about 2 weeks ago, that it's a holistic view that Christianity has. We can't separate our lives into little compartments and say, well, we're one way at work and another way on Sunday morning. That doesn't fit the Christian worldview. If it's true here, it's true there. But also that holistic view is mind and soul and body, right? And when we go on missions, we need to focus in on that, take care of people's physical needs as well as their spiritual needs. And then we're looking at a restoration back to what Adam and Eve had, that we lost, the fall, what Jesus Christ paid for to take care of our sins, resurrected for the next part, which is to bring us to that new state in the future. That is our hope. Yeah.
So the follow that there'll be like another dimension to our life, a fourth dimension where there will be more our thoughts, our brain will be more. We're only using 10% now.
Right.
100%. Can you imagine what we could accomplish and what we could think?
Absolutely, and you're bringing up a good point, because that's a really key point, because we have no idea what a perfect body would be like, because we don't have perfect bodies. And I'm sure Don has told me many times that his current body is failing him quite often. And we all get to that point. I'm starting to feel it now. My back's hurting all the time. So we don't know what it's like to have these types of bodies that would go on and on and on. If you look at it, how long did Adam and Eve live? Hundreds and hundreds of years. But their lives were cut short because of the sin of the fall. Can you imagine just going on and on and on and on? In theory, scientists will tell you this, in theory, the body could live on forever because it replenishes itself constantly. But it degrades over time, and they're trying to figure out why it degrades over time, because it has the ability to continue to go on, which I thought that was really fascinating when I read that, because I was like, oh, so the body has inherent within it the ability to go back to what Adam and Eve was, but some reason why it's not doing it. It degrades over time. Entropy. There's one Christian scholar, he always talks about sin as like entropy. And it was really interesting he was talking about, because entropy is the idea that if you leave this room and you leave and you come back, it's going to be more disordered than it was. In other words, if you just leave it here, it's going to get dirty and dusty, and it's eventually going to break down. And when they look at the universe, they say the same thing. Eventually, the universe is just going to be all scattered out everywhere, and nothing will be organized into stars or planets or anything like that. This law of entropy just kind of moves towards disorder. And it's interesting that our God's a God of order, too, right? And then this thing called entropy kind of comes in and kind of destroys our universe, or is destroying our universe, and us as well. So in that way, it is a lot like sin. I'm not saying that it's equated to sin, but it is a lot like sin. It takes order and turns it into disorder. Well, so our idea is to restore our bodies back to what it is. So when we talk about the resurrection, we're talking about Jesus' resurrection. We're not talking about anything like reincarnation. We're not talking about he rose again from the dead from in a bodily state, but we're going to be up sitting in clouds playing harps for all eternity. Right? Yeah. That would be kind of boring. We were designed for work. Adam and Eve had work in the garden. So when we talk about a new heavens and a new earth, there's going to be some type of work, because that's how we get our fulfillment. We're designed that way, right?
The Garden of Eden again.
Yeah.
Will be restored as well.
Yeah.
We'll be out there.
Yeah. Well, there'll be a new Jerusalem, and it's very. The Bible paints it in some very vivid pictures. I don't know if it's going to be exactly like that, but because I think it's a big cube, is the way it defines it. But it's going to be something very spectacular, and he will be there, and we will be there, and we'll live on that earth, that new heavens and new earth, and whatever that means.
I always pictured, I guess I probably had it all wrong, that we'll be for 1,000 years on this earth that's restored after it's burned up and then completely restored. And then the cube comes down, and then we are in heaven with other bodies, whatever. We'll have our.
Yeah, so.
But maybe that's all wrong.
Well, there's different views on that. There's different what we call millennial views, amillennial, where there's no millennial reign type of thing. We just move on to that. And then there's views that we do have this intermediate time where there is a reign on the earth with the resurrected. Although I don't know that they formulated that, at least I haven't seen it, as to what happens after that 1,000 years of reign, whether or not we continue on in the new heavens and new earth, or was that the new heavens and the new earth, and then we go to a Platonic type of state.
Because we're tested again by Satan.
Right.
So something happened after.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't. For me, I don't get too much onto that, because a lot of the eschatology, which is really neat to read all the books, the problem is I could read 3 different views on something, and I like whether it's the pre, post, or mid tribulation or no tribulation. In every one of them you read, you're like, oh, they make a good case. 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 I mean, I can read the Bible and I can see all those different views, and so I'm like, okay. So I'm more of a whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And my job, as the Bible exhorts me, is to pay attention.
Pan-millennium?
What?
Pan-millennium?
Pan-millennium? It's going to happen all the time? No. I'm very pragmatic. You watch the signs, which is what we're, like the virgins, right? We're supposed to watch. And then he's going to come, and then we'll know. I think as we get closer, to become more and more apparent as to what it is. But until then, I don't know.
Yeah, the pastor, Larry, laid down the parameters of permissible belief. He said there were 4 acceptable views. And if you're interested in that, you can ask people what they believe. But he did not come down with any kind of dogmatic statement and exclude 3 of the 4 views, although the least held view is the cube out of the sky being a literal thing that's almost as big as the moon, but square, a cube, and comes down and sits on the earth, which is only about 3 or 4 times as thick through the diameter as the moon is. So you got this enormity, this monstrosity of a celestial body wobbling around the sun. So most people who look at these things in detail and discover from the standpoint of should we take the book of Revelation in its raw literal sense, most scholarly types suggest no, and most of them are amillennialists, which means nothing. Numbers don't mean that much. But I'm an amillennialist, and I read the book of Revelation until I'm quite tired of it. If I can say such a true thing. I've read a great deal about it. I think we have several other amillennialists here where the millennium itself, since the beginning of the church, has never been considered to be a literal 1,000 years. It makes no sense. We earlier talked at the text in Hebrews. It says, you live once, you die the judgment. To give a 1,000-year opportunity to other people, a second chance, as it were, it's appealing. Jehovah's Witnesses believe in that. everybody gets a second chance. But the difficulties of the literal view of Revelation are enormous, enormous. Then you would have to believe that there are beings in the universe created by God with a face of a bull here and the face of an eagle here and the human face here. Oh, what's the other one? A monkey? I forgot.
Man.
Yeah, I mean, oh, that's right. Thank you. Yeah, the human. Oh, I was thinking of the evolved monkey. So anyway, it's probably there isn't a four-faced creature.
You just described one of my ex-girlfriends.
So I'm wrong on that score, but I mean.
So anyway, like I say, when it comes down to that, like there's like he said, there's permissible things that are within the pale of orthodoxy, and then there's things that are out there. And I like I said, I'm more of a whatever's going to happen is going to happen. It's not important to what salvation is for people, and it's not important compared to what the Bible clearly teaches about the restoration of the way Adam and Eve were in our restoration.
I think we need to be really careful when you were talking about missions, when we're talking about salvation, we don't get off into these weeds. We need to, but to go back to what's going to happen, I think we need a little bit more than that. But we certainly can't get off into a lot of this other stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking about salvation. We got to first accept who God is and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always a good idea to make sure we have our priorities, right? What's the most important thing right now? And us being here with God and working with Him to further His kingdom is what's really most important for us. And we can debate some of these other details
It's fun.
till the cows come home, right? But yes, you're right. It's fun. But one thing that we did talk about C.S. Lewis, and I was going to get it and email it to all of you. Because we talked about last week his famous statement that we can say that Jesus Christ is a good moral teacher, but he didn't leave that option open to us, that he's only a good moral teacher. He's either a liar, lunatic, or he is God. Those are the only options you have, because if he said the kinds of things that he did say, well, he's either a liar, lunatic, or he is God. And so C.S. Lewis also says Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is infinite importance. In other words, what he's saying, if Christianity really turned out not to be true, doesn't matter. You're a better person today than you were yesterday, so great, but you can become a Buddhist and do the same thing. But if it is true, and there is going to be an eternal separation from God, then this is the most important thing of all in our lives. If you think about it, because you're either going to spend eternity with Him or away from Him. And that's the question that we all have. And when you look at everybody else's lives, that should be the heart for us. Do you really want them to not? I mean, if they choose not to be with God for eternity, then that's their choice. But if they don't know, then we want them to know at least, right? The one thing that we cannot say is that it's moderately important, right? We can't say that Christianity is, well, it's kind of really good and it's kind of really beneficial. And all this. Well, either it's important or it's not important. And it's either infinitely important or it doesn't really matter at all. So, again, he's pointing out there's really no middle ground. Jesus didn't leave us any middle ground with the resurrection. He doesn't leave us any middle ground with this either. And so it's just important, and why I'm pointing this out, because in this class what we're saying is one of the most important evidences for Christianity is Jesus' resurrection. And like this gentleman pointed out in a previous class, Paul talks about all the evidence that points towards that. And we're going to talk about all that stuff. So that's why it's really important. Another thing that we have to talk about, which we talked a little bit about last time, is that everybody has bias. And it'd be wrong for us to say we don't have a bias. Because once you become a Christian, then you are going to have a bias towards the supernatural, towards God, towards the resurrection being true. We can admit that, and we can still look at the evidence objectively. We can look at the evidence objectively if we admit that we're biased, and we maintain the idea that we are biased towards that direction. That doesn't mean we're wrong, right? It's really helpful, especially when you're talking to an atheist or an agnostic or somebody who doesn't believe, that we say, yes, I do have a bias, but there's this evidence. Paul talked about this evidence. I'm going to talk about this evidence, and that's why I believe it to be true. And then you point out that you also have a bias. You have a bias against it, right? So now now we've got all our cards out on the table. Now we can have an actual real discussion about it without them. And anytime they bring up their bias, you say, well, is that a bias? Are you looking at the evidence? Are you being biased to the evidence? Are you treating this evidence like you would treat any other evidence? See, now we already got the cards on the table that we're both biased. And now we can ask those questions. Is that tainting the way you're looking at this evidence? So that's really important.
What does bias mean?
Bias just means you have a predisposition against something or for something. So,
Disposition without any foundation?
not necessarily. You can still have a bias and there still could be a foundation for it. Right? So once you become a Christian, you are going to be biased towards the Christian worldview. But if it's truth, then that's not a problem. But we just still want to recognize that we're being biased when we look at some evidence. Because sometimes we can look at evidence and say, okay, is this evidence for or against God? Right? I'm a Christian. So obviously I'm assuming that it's going to point in that direction. But if I'm honest, sometimes I'm going to say, if I look at like the problem of evil, I'm going to be honest, as a biased Christian, I think it's solvable. But I have to be honest and say, that is a ding against our position. Because we really don't have a great answer for that. We have answers that work logically. They don't really hit people at an emotional level. Right? So I can say I'm biased and I can look at all this other evidence and I can point all that evidence in there. But I think my bias is coming from all this other evidence that I have over here. I'm just recognizing that I have this. So if all this other stuff's true, then this has got to be true. Yes?
Yeah, Don, I was just thinking of Bertrand Russell, the famous agnostic, or Thomas Huxley.
Right.
Same opponents of Christianity, wrote copiously against Scripture, against Christianity. I think both of them said that they didn't really appreciate Christianity because it hindered their sexual expression. So that was a bias toward rejecting Christianity. But these men, brilliant as they were, admitted that they had a bias in favor of sex over God. So that was kind of generous of them, wasn't it? Is that a strong bias? At least that's what they find on television.
There's a number of scientists that have made the same statement or similar statements that he's talking about with Bertrand Russell when it comes to looking at evolution.
Right.
And some of them will even go so far as, I favor evolution not because it makes sense to me, because it doesn't. This is very telling when an evolutionist tells you this, but I do it because I don't want there to be a God. That has got to be the most honest statement I've ever heard from somebody. I mean, he's recognizing his bias. He's not changing his opinion, but he recognizes his bias and says, hey, this is what my bias is. So even if you have it, it may not change. Even if you recognize that you have it, it may not change the way they are. Of course, if you read Romans 1, which you can do that on your own, if you read Romans 1, it'll tell you why they're doing that. But the fact that they recognize it is very, very, very telling, that they can see that and still see it. So, good thing, who has a bias? Everyone has a bias and presuppositions. We do too. However, intellectual integrity requires that we set them aside to the point that we can recognize them for what they are. That's all it is. So we can look at the evidence honestly. When you go and you're on a jury and you go to court or something like that, when they ask you to look at the evidence, how do they ask you to look at the evidence? Unbiasedly. And they will ask you, if you can't be unbiased, then we don't want you to be on the jury. Right. So it's possible. I mean, you know, and they'll ask you, can you maintain this? I mean, do you have? And that's what the whole point of why they ask you when you get in the jury. They ask you all these questions. Do you know any police officers? They want to know if you have any biases, or you're likely to have biases. And even sometimes I've noticed this because I've sat in I got selected once, but one of the other times I was sitting there, I sort of wanted to get picked, but because I think it was like a murder case or something like that, and I just said, I want to get picked because I've never been in one of those. I was on a little one, which was a misdemeanor type of, not a misdemeanor, low-level felony, but it was interesting to listen to people, and they would ask, do you know any police officers? Well, yes, I do. Okay, can you be objective in ruling on this case, even though you know police officers? So they say, hey, you might have a bias, but can you set that aside, that bias, and just look at the evidence for what it is? Right? And I saw people saying, I don't think I can. And then the judge has all these other questions. Like, can you really, because I guess the judge is just trying to figure out if they're trying to get out of jury duty, right? Because yes, it's really easy if you just say, no, I'm biased and I think that guy's guilty of sin. In fact, why are we here? Just take him out. But the judge will kind of look at you too, kind of say, well, are you just trying to get out of, or can you really do it? Because we believe that people they can take their bias and set it aside, right? So when we're talking to someone who doesn't believe in the resurrection, doesn't believe in Jesus Christ, we want to kind of explore that idea somewhere along this conversation, just so that they're aware that they may have a bias, and so that we can, point that out if they have it, so that it'll make them more open to listening to it. So,
Would you say that a person doesn't believe in the resurrection or in the existence of Christ or God? Isn't that more of a negative in the sense that there's nothing to show me that there is a God, rather than a bias that's based on something?
I think if you read Romans 1 again, he talks about it and he says they should know God basically because of creation.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that God has created is here, and it witnesses to them that there is a God.
They should know.
And they're suppressing it. And he says the natural man will suppress that. So the question is, there's going to be what we call cognitive dissonance. That is, what you know to be true and what you're acting like is true are in conflict with one another, and your brain just can't handle it. It just says there's a problem. There's a disconnect between reality and what I believe, or what I'm saying I believe. And it's eventually going to snap. It may either snap and it may be a bad thing, where you have a lot of mental issues, or snap in a good way where you say, I have to admit that this is correct and this is true. And so what Romans 1 is talking about is that dissonance between what we know, what we can see from all of nature, all the organization of nature, and what they have you believe is that this is all just random chance, that everything's just random chance.
So
That there's no order, there's no purpose, there's no meaning.
that would be a good place to start a conversation.
Absolutely, that's the best place to start a conversation, because you are touching what they know to be true, and you're pointing out this disconnect that they have. And so then they're going to have to deal with this disconnect. Like, why does it appear to be order in the universe? Of course, now with evolution and all of its forms that it's taken in other things, because it's left the biology realm, and it's now they're saying that society evolves and psychologically we evolve, and so they're turning evolution into everything, right? Politics evolves, and so so a lot of people are in this mindset that things move from disorder towards order, which of course is against what we talked about entropy, which is going from order to disorder, right? They're saying that it goes from disorder to order. Well, how do you get something how do you take a bunch of anything and turn it into something that's ordered? And I mean, when you have kids or grandkids and they go in you buy them Legos, do you buy the set of Legos where it's all disordered and you put it together? You don't shake the box and then you open it up and then it's all together randomly. No, you have a design. They have a little book that explains to you how you build it and you make into a design. And when you look at it, that is evidence that some intelligence worked with this and said, put this together in this order and you'll get this thing. And then it has this purpose, whether it's for kids to have fun or whatever.
So that gives rise to intelligent design.
Right.
Of the universe.
Right. And so,
God.
right. And so that's one of the evidences that you can talk about, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking that you brought up a couple of different things. Cognitive dissonance bias, and we could hang all these notions on a single hook, because one of Christian's favorite all-time expressions of any profound genius is that of Einstein, when he said, I refuse to believe that God plays dice with the universe. Okay, that explains his prejudice or his bias. He simply refused to believe it and said so. But in speaking of God as though God existed, Christians enjoy that because we can use it to promote Christianity, at least in a rudimentary or fundamental way. However, the reason that he said that is because he was studying this abstruse science, quantum physics, which was subatomic particles. And he was trying with his organized genius mathematical mind to arrange some kind of developmental status for reasonable behavior among these subatomic particles. And he couldn't, because they tend to move thither and yon, and you can't predict the movement of any subatomic particle ever. So it just does what it wants to do. And so he looks at it, and he almost has a nervous breakdown. He says, this is what I'm seeing in the laboratory, but I refuse to believe that God is playing dice with the universe and allowing this random motion. On the other hand, God evidently did, because that's what molecules and subatomic particles do. So we have bias, evidently, nebulously or cloudily enough. Einstein believed in some kind of deity, and was a little disappointed that his universe was not so dissonant cognitively. Does it all make sense now?
I'm putting that down.
Raise your hand. That's all.
I didn't get that down. I got this down.
I'm just talking to Don. He and I have-
But you still couldn't tie his shoes, right?
No, I don't need
It's
it.
randomly collected too.
So, yes.
In dealing with an atheist, for instance, they say, I'm not interested in hearing about God. I don't believe in God. Could you say, how long have you not believed in God? Was there ever a time when you believed in God? Because I believe a lot of children do.
Yeah.
They ask, who created all this stuff? And they come to the conclusion that there's got to be a higher power. But their parents, very often, or the people they're around, will deny that, and so they'll come to that. So could you say, what turned you to believing that there was no God?
Yeah,
And get them thinking.
right. Yeah, and I think that that's a good approach, because you're asking them to start thinking about what they just assume is true.
Yeah.
Like, why do you assume that that's true? So basically what you're doing is they don't want to talk about Christianity, and you're just flipping the coin on them and say, okay, let's talk about your worldview.
Yeah.
And you're starting why did you come to this worldview? Then you could start exploring what it means, what the implications of their worldview means, like morality and stuff like that. Then you can start playing with all those other things. So if they don't want to talk about Christianity, that's great. I have a lot of questions for you, because, I'm not an atheist, and I don't know how one could become one. So please explain to me, what does it mean to you? How did you become one? And all this kind of stuff. So if they don't want to talk about Christianity, that's fine. Let's talk about your worldview and the myriad problems that it has philosophically.
That's the best.
Evidentially. So,
And you hit him with the evidence.
yes. Speaking of evidence, so this comes from the book that I had recommended, the one book, and he says, in our opinion, the quality and quantity of evidence that Christianity is true far surpasses the evidence in favor of any other religion or worldview. That's a bold claim, but I think it's substantiated. That is, no matter what worldview you have or religious beliefs that you have, that the quality and quantity of the evidence for Christianity best aligns with what reality is. What our experience is in reality. So it's like a court case. Is atheism true or Christianity true? Well, let's look at all the evidence and see if all the evidence points towards one or the other, maybe some points in one direction. Where's the preponderance of evidence leave us? Pointing towards or away from Christianity? I mean, that's an honest thing to do. You could talk to an atheist, and all you're doing when you're talking to him that way is say, okay, we'll let you go first. You defend your worldview. Then when we find that it's deficient, then I can show you why I think Christianity aligns with what reality is more than the other. Yes?
Are you familiar with the Scopes monkey trial?
Yeah.
How does that relate to the statement you just made, which was actually, I believe, the idea of evolution on trial?
Right. It's a really big topic, and maybe you don't want to tag on it now, but just to give you just a tidbit, there is a presupposition in science, a bias towards naturalism that rules out any intelligence. when you look at anything scientific. They will say that that's the only way science can be done, and they say that, and they call that scientism, that science is the only way that you can understand truth. The problem is, I think I may have even mentioned it before, that statement in and of itself cannot be proved by science. So if only science can prove true, how do you prove that statement by science? You can't. So what are you left with? That is a biased or presupposition that you apply when you look at the evidence. This is why, so it actually ties in with exactly what we're talking about here. If we're looking at the evidence and we set aside our biases, so I'm not going to be biased. So if I look at all the evidence for fine-tuning in the universe, in other words, the universe is fine-tuned for us. All right, so if I look at all that evidence and not assume that it is designed for us, and I don't assume naturalism that it's not designed for us and we're just lucky chance, I look at all of it and I say to myself, is it more likely that chance is responsible or more likely that design is responsible? I think you only can come to the conclusion that design is the right answer. Because by chance, probabilistically, it's insanely, and we can do all the numbers, but I'm not going to do it in this class. That's another class. You can take one of my other classes, we'll talk about that. But if you look at it, chances, it's impossible for all intent and purpose. So what does it only leave us with? Without a bias, the only conclusion you really can come to is design.
Is it possible that evolution is a design?
It's possible. There is that position. I don't hold that position, but there is what we call theistic evolutionists, people that believe that God front-loaded the universe with all the information so that it would, go from disorder to order. There's a lot of problems with that, and that's why I don't hold that position. But it is a position that some people do hold. I think I was trying to think of somebody who did it, but I forget who actually holds it. Anyway.
Other thing these days, evolution of politics or evolution of society and so on and so forth, or culture. Rather than evolution, I would call it change, but not evolution.
Yeah, well,
I don't know if there's a significant difference or not, but I see a difference.
Yeah, there is
evolution, because evolution to me indicates a progression that improves upon the prior.
But that's exactly what they think. I mean, that's exactly what they're thinking, right? That's what they think.
Yeah.
They even call it evolutionary psychology. That's the official name of the area of study. And that area of study is, well, the reason why we have morals is because long time ago, these people were together and they were more apt to survive because they worked together, and that's where our morality comes from. The problem with that is that's a very nice story. But what evidence do they have that in evolutionary past and history that there was a group of people that existed that exhibited this behavior and then that this is why this behavior happened? There's absolutely no evidence for it. If you read any of their stuff, and I'm listening to some lectures about human behavior, and it's done by an evolutionary psychologist, and he's got a lot of really good stories that sound very plausible. But they only sound plausible if evolution is true, one. Two, even if evolution was true and it was plausible, it doesn't mean that it actually happened. So when they say that that's science, they're talking about something completely different than what most of us learned as science, where you test something, it is predictable, and you can recreate it. When you talk about sociology or psychology, evolutionary psychology, they have no evidence whatsoever. It's all stories. And it sounds really good, sounds scientific. Guy's wearing a white lab coat, so he must be right. Got PhD after his name. That means everything he says is golden.
And I think historically people are not as crazy as they used to be. No, wait a minute. Let me take that back.
So anyways,
They're crazy.
that gives you kind of an idea of what we talk about with bias, right? You can see it. There's a bias in science. There's a bias in the psychology departments. There's biases all around. Once we know what the biases are, we can pinpoint them and we can point them out. This means that we can have an honest discussion about something. And we can actually look at the evidence, put the biases aside, and say which way does it point towards.
And the biggest bias is that it earns you a living as a scientist or a psychologist or et cetera, et cetera.
There's a money connection.
Yeah, there's always a money connection because you got to get that next grant so you can justify your existence, right?
Well, I have a question that would it at this time be, if you were talking to someone who is really a tough nut to crack, and would it be a good idea to bring up the fact that, well, in all the movies that we see, especially cartoons, there's always a bad guy and a good guy. There's always good and bad. So therefore, if there is a creator, there is a good God, then naturally there would be also a bad spirit or a dark God. And therefore, would he not want us to be biased in a negative way for the destruction of the earth? Or would that get too involved? But I mean, there is a working force against the ways people think,
Right.
to make them think in a way that has nothing to do with God, and that is the design of Satan.
Yeah, there's only one pitfall with that there's one pitfall that I kind of can see where they could go to, and that is they could come up with the conclusion, well, there is an equal force of good and an equal force of evil, right? And so then a lot of Eastern religions will have the yin and the yang, and that the good and the bad are necessary. Whereas the Christian view is God is all good. He didn't create evil. Evil is what we call a privation or an absence of good. And so we would just want to be careful when we went down that road that we aren't saying that, to make it clear, yeah.
Supreme good versus
Yeah, we don't want to get too close into that idea that they're like equal somehow or something like that. But what you are articulating is kind of what we talked about, the way things ought to be, right? Because your approach is really focusing in on what they know is true in their heart, that there is good and evil. Everybody knows that in their heart. And so you're kind of focusing in on that. Everybody thinks and lives as if there is truth and error. Now, they want to say that there's no truth when it fits with their sexual proclivities or their greed or whatever else it is. Then it's subjective. You take something from them and all of a sudden there's the truth and then you're wrong.
They just want to draw the lines in a different place.
Well,
Because they'll always say, my neighbor didn't treat me right. That was wrong.
right.
But, gee, I can do all the sexual promiscuity that I want. That's good.
Right.
It's got to be good. So they just draw the line differently.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a little bit of cognitive dissonance in that too, because I think they're going to still know that what they're doing is not good, even if they try to redraw the lines. Deep down in their hearts, they may not be conscious of it, but it's going to be in there somewhere. So another good question, because you're kind of talking to what we're talking about here, how do you have an effective dialogue with somebody? And I think there's things that we need to learn about that. And one is we need to learn to summarize our arguments in less than 30 seconds. I have a problem with this because there's a lot to all of these arguments.
Yes.
But we kind of have to, like, if we're going to talk about the resurrection, Hank Hanegraaff has a really good thing. He calls it the feat of the resurrection, F-E-A-T. And each one of those means a particular piece of evidence that he wants you to remember to articulate back, right? We're going to talk about the 5 pieces of evidence. N.T. Wright, I believe, has 6 different things that he thinks can, and I think there's some people that say, well, we can just argue with 1. Whatever it is, whatever works with you, whatever you understand, that's the argument that you want to be able to have, and have it in less than 30 seconds. I was listening to this marketing thing to market to state employees, because it's from where I work, we're getting into doing stuff for the state. We do stuff for a lot of local governments and counties, but we don't do stuff for the state of California. So we're looking at getting into it. One of the videos that the state had produced was you need to have an elevator sales pitch. You have 30 seconds to say who you are, how you can help them, and how they can get a hold of you in 30 seconds. And so they said, that's what we want you to do, is you need to be able to have that because you don't want to waste their time. You want to give them a sales pitch, but it needs to be 30 seconds long, and you need to tell them everything that they need to know. So you have to summarize everything down into that.
I get that all the time on the phone. These guys trying to sell me something.
Yeah, well, some of those, yeah, they talk over you and stuff like that.
On the TV commercial.
Yeah, well, you want to get it in 30 seconds. Now, once you make your argument in 30 seconds, these are the 5 or 4 or 3 or whatever your evidences are that you have for the resurrection. These are my evidences for it. This is why I believe it. Now you've had that. Now they can kind of come back. You've made your 30-second speech. Now they can say, well, I disagree with this point. Okay, let's explore that point. Now we have a thing. We oftentimes start with saying, well, and we go on to everything else. We need to start our conversations with, this is why I believe the resurrection is true. These 4 points, these 5 points, whatever it is. Then they can nitpick at one of those, and then we can go towards one of those and talk about why we believe that there was an empty tomb. Why we believe that Jesus did die when he was on the cross and didn't live somehow and then got revived when he was in a cold, dark place. So we can then talk about those things, but we want to be able to start off the conversation, say, okay, this is why I believe it. This is the evidence that I look at, how I understand it, and why I've come to this conclusion. Do that in 30 seconds. Great way to start. Then they can say, okay, let's talk about it. Another point that they bring out is everything should be as simple as possible, but not too simple. Or in other words, we have our 5 pieces of evidence. These are our 5 pieces of evidence. That's as simple as it gets. We have a tendency just to focus on 1 or 2. No, this is as simple as it gets. These are the 5 evidence. Together, we believe that this points towards the resurrection really happened. So another way to look at this, because some people are going to be in a mindset of because we talked about this a little bit. During Easter time and during Christmas time, you'll see Newsweek, Time, Life magazine will all have these little exposés in the counter as you go through the checkout at the grocery store, right? Little magazines that purport to talk about Jesus' life and whatever new thing has been discussed about it. Now, most of the information they get from, if you look at the scholars involved in it, are coming from a place called the Jesus Seminar. And one of the big proponents of the Jesus Seminar, the founder of it, is John Dominic Crossan. And his name is going to come up quite often in this class because he's one of the main proponents against the resurrection. And he says he's a Christian scholar. Interesting. Anyways, and there was a...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Christian scholar or Christian?
He claims to be a Christian scholar. He's not a... I wouldn't hold him as a Christian, no. But because he's not holding to Orthodox Christianity. So I don't know what he believes about God per se. But he's a Christian scholar, a New Testament scholar. So he has a TV show. If you look, The Search for Jesus, it was July 2000 on ABC. I think if you look at, you might find it on YouTube or something like that.
He's been on since then.
Yeah, he's been on.
Looks familiar.
He's been on quite a few times. There's a lot of, if you know who the scholars are, like in the Jesus Seminar, which are people that, by the way, they pass around a bag and you pull a rock out of it to determine whether or not it's true or not, and depending upon the color that you put on it, depends upon whether you think it's true or not. So everything, the Bible is determined whether it's true or not, any given passage, based upon a vote of these people who are self-selected, and if you're not a liberal scholar, you're not going to get selected to be in the group. Bias, 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 bias. Compound that all together and we're going to give you a worldview, right? And so that's where this is coming from. The problem is he's a New Testament scholar, and when people watch this show in 2000 on ABC, or they read those magazines, what picture are they going to get that scholars think about Christianity? Meanwhile, they leave out people like N.T. Wright, Bloom, Craig, Evans. There's all kinds of other New Testament scholars, Keener, excellent scholars that have done excellent work in this area that would not agree with this gentleman at all. In fact, the majority of scholars in New Testament would be against what he says. But the only view you get in the media is this one view. I'm not saying that's by design or whatever, that's just the way it is.
Word of warning in any of these shows that whether they have these sort of called Christian discussions on there, you have to really pay attention because some of those guys are comfortable to say this my guy might say.
Oh, yeah.
And they're claiming to be good Christians. I don't know how to put it, but
Exactly.
I wonder, where do you get that? It's not in the Bible. It's not put that way.
And that's the question always asked. Asking questions never hurts. And if you question anybody, anything, and people will say, oh, you shouldn't say that. But yeah, you should question what even Pastor Larry says. I mean, the Bereans, they search the scripture to see what things are true. That's what you should do. So when this guy says something, you should search it out. See, okay, he says that this didn't happen. Why does he think that didn't happen? What evidence does he have? And what evidence is there against it? One of his big famous things is Jesus was never buried. He was thrown into, and this is what he says, he was thrown into a pile of bodies and eaten by dogs. That's what he said. Where does he get that idea? Right? So he comes up with some other things like, in ancient Roman culture, this is what they typically did. Well, if you go to court and you say, well, this is what they typically did over in this part of the world, does it really apply to this part of the world? You'd ask that question. Well, that happened, like if you came to, in the future, you said, well, the United States, people were very sexually prudish. Well, that was true in 1650 when the Puritans were here. Is that true today? Well, so it differs in time, and the Roman Empire was a very long Roman Empire. So saying what it was at one point in time is not indicative of that it being that way during the entire time of the Roman Empire. Just as saying that sexual morality in the United States was the same from 1650 to 1999 or whatever it is. Obviously, there is a change. And so you have to be very careful when scholars will say things like that, because they will nitpick and choose evidence that supports their claim, leaving out some evidence that refutes it. So you have to know these things, and it requires that we do some studying, or at least read books. Like Craig Evans writes books that refute just about everything that this guy says. Craig Evans does. There's a couple other folks out there that write books as well. That specifically focus in on what Bart Ehrman is saying, who is another scholar who was a Christian. Now he says he's agnostic, who follows some of the same conclusions that this gentleman does. Again, but he's got a bias, and he's showing it. He's particularly insidious because he comes across very witty and nice, and everybody kind of likes him because the way he talks and the way he kind of says, well, it would be like this, but you've got to listen to his evidence, because his evidence isn't evidence. It's like, well, it happens this way here, so why wouldn't it happen that way there? That's not really evidence. Anyways.
Just to break into your thought temporarily in 30 seconds. This is not just a persuasion, some of these enormously erroneous teachings, something that happens exclusively on the scholarly level. This works its way down into the various denominations, so that we have with us at least 3 former Presbyterians. One of the 3 is sitting here in my chair, and it must be me. And the reason that I ceased and desisted after having a tremendously great time in a specific church in Sonora, where I taught Sunday school, asking questions for 4.5 years. Okay, so and doing a little teaching on the side too. So anyway.
30 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, worth another 30. The visiting pastor in one of the largest Presbyterian churches in Northern California, right here in Clayton, USA, not more than 40 miles away from here, if that. He said in his introductory remarks, the Bible is a dangerous book. It dehumanizes women, and it speaks against homosexuals. The Bible is a dangerous book, and went on in that vein for the full 30-minute sermon. That was the last sermon that I ever listened to in a Presbyterian church. Quit that day. So this is not just a problem with scholars living in their ivory towers. This gets right down into in this case, Presbyterian Church USA, which is losing 50,000 members each year because of their liberal teachings and their just simple repetition of errors like Black Bart Ehrman and Croissants and others. They're scoundrels, but they're being believed by pastors. So I'm saying.
I think Don's whole point to it is just because it says this guy's a scholar, don't accept that.
Right, absolutely.
Like read, picking up a newspaper and look at the headline, and okay, that's the way it is. And you get right down into the story in the headline, in the paper, under that headline, it may be completely different from the headline. But
Oh yeah, absolutely. That is a big problem.
Yeah,
Because it kind of,
and scholars certainly differ on this. And he brought up Presbyterian Church when this homosexuality thing really started coming into the forefront. about 8 or 9 years ago in this particular presbytery. I was very much involved in a Presbyterian church over there, and it finally came to a trial. I mean, a literal court trial with 9 judges. It's like the Supreme Court. And there were people with PhDs, letters, after their name, as long as their name or longer. They had all this. And they're on both sides. So people are different. They see it different. And
Yeah.
one would say, yeah, this is acceptable. The other one would say, no, it's not acceptable. And they could quote the Bible from one end to the other and all of the relevant texts and articles that go with it. It was just, it's kind of like listening to Don over here. It was just brilliant.
Yeah.
But you have to be very careful and let the Spirit get involved.
Yep.
And you have Satan crawling in.
Well, it's an important thing that I want to point out too is that as most people point out, that these scholars, most genuine scholars, reject their methods and their conclusions. So how they come to the conclusion, plus the conclusion that they come to. For example, Luke Timothy Johnson, who's Anglican, I believe, says that the group is self-selected based upon a prior commitment to radical liberal views. So in order to be in the group, you got to be a radical liberal. Otherwise, you're not going to be in the group. Craig Bloomberg, another large name in biblical studies, says that their methodology is seriously flawed and their conclusions are unnecessarily skeptical. And Crossan himself admits, and this is an important thing, so this liberal scholar who's saying all these things, he admits that his views are not representative of most scholars. So he admits that he's in the minority. That most scholars who are doing scholarly work, trying to follow scholarly things, are not coming to his conclusion. The question is the average person who's watching that TV show or reading that magazine, are they equipped to recognize how misleading that scholarship is? Right? So you talked about they had a trial and they had all those people there. No doubt some of those poor scholars who are poor, not, I feel bad for them, poor that they're not good scholars, who are making their views known, they're taking some of the people away because those people are not equipped to see that they're wrong. So this is why training in the church and studying in classes like this are really vitally important for all believers. It's one of the things that we're commanded to do, and that is to give evidence for what we believe and to be able to give it with gentleness and respect. And this is one of the things that the church, evangelical church in general, has been very lacking in doing for the last 150 years. It's starting to change, which I'm glad to see that the change is coming. But it's important that we all recognize. There's no bias on which most people can counter these authoritative sounding statements. I love the way he says it because he says authoritative sounding statements. They're not authoritative, they just sound authoritative. If you're wearing a white jacket, like what I said about scientists, you're wearing a white jacket and it says PhD behind your name, must know what he's talking about. Doesn't mean that they know what they're talking about.
Squeaky wheel syndrome, it really is. They're very much more outspoken than, quote, Christians, conservative Christians, or what we evangelical Christians.
Right. They're much more outspoken than most Christians because they've not been equipped to answer these questions. They're not equipped to do it. I mean,
more TV time and all that sort of thing.
And they spend too much time on TV. Yeah, I wrote a Facebook post about that, about the amount of time. All right, normal average time to get a PhD is 8 years of school. The normal amount of time per month that somebody would, or per week, or the normal amount of hours that a student would be involved in school, in other words, in class and out of class doing studying, for that 8 years turns out to be, if you look at the averages, 5,160 hours or something like that, 5,000 hour range. The normal amount of, or average TV watching that people do is 16,400 in the same period of time. So if you think about it, you could still watch a lot of TV, 10,000 hours in 8 years, and still get a PhD. But what do most people do? They actually spend the 16,000 hours watching TV and none or very little doing anything scholarly. And I'm not saying that everybody has to go to school and go to college and do all that kind of stuff. But if someone is selling you something, even in that box that you're watching at home, you need to be able to be equipped to answer those questions. We send our kids to college every year where teachers are very openly about saying, I eat Christians for lunch. I'm going to destroy their worldview. And we send our kids there with no preparation whatsoever for what their worldview is or how to defend it. And so most of them don't even know what the Christian worldview is, so they don't know how to defend it. They haven't been given the tools to defend it, and then what ends up happening? They drift away. Now, some of them come back, but much later in life, after they've gone through some of life's problems and they've had to deal with it and other things. So it seems to me it would be better for us to train them before they go to college than trying to deal with it when they're in their 30s and 40s and they're having a crisis in their life. And God forbid, we hope they don't die in that period of time, right? So these are the things that we have to focus in on. One of the things, the Pew Forum does a lot of surveys and stuff like that. In September 28, 2010, they came out with it, and it said atheists and agnostics score higher on it, in other words, how much they know about the Bible, than anyone else, closely followed by Jews, Mormons. All Christians, Protestants, Catholics were far behind. Why is it that they know more about our book than we know about our own book? Because what they actually know is all the problems, but they don't know all the solutions to whatever those problems were, which are all in existence.
Don't you think there's a lot of influences too? I mean, they're getting grants, they're working with groups that are very, one-sided, and so they're influenced greatly to not believe the truth,
Right.
or to convince themselves that.
There's a long, in the last class that I did here, we did, I forgot what it's called, Loving God with All Your Mind. I call it Stewardship of the Mind, but we called it Loving God with All Your Mind. And one of the things that we talked about in the beginning of that class, and the videos are online, and if you want them, I can show you where they're at. We talk about how the church in the 1700s started getting out of academics and leaving academics to these other scientists. And they left the hard sciences and just stuck with the humanities, and then it became this split. Most colleges had the humanities and the sciences. Well, the science and psychology and sociology was under the humanities, but now the science side, which Christians all left, has now become very much Darwinist, evolutionary, all that kind of stuff. Now they're going into psychology with evolutionary psychology. They're getting into sociology. They're already there. They're already taken that one over. And they're going into all these other areas of the colleges, and the Christians have just, what we've done is not defended. We've just, okay, you can have sociology. Okay, you can have psychology. Instead of creating an argument for our position, our worldview, we've just basically said faith is something that you just believe and you can't prove. So we're just going to get out of that. So you can prove whatever you want to prove with facts, and we'll just ignore the facts. The problem is what we should have been doing is, no, the Christian worldview accounts for these things, and then went back. We didn't. We've just been on a retreating.
We needed more panographs than those.
Yes.
Let me back that up with personal experience, what it says about the church being ignorant. 22 years as a Jehovah's Witness on 2 continents, and 9,000 hours going from door to door. I was stunned at the ignorance of those who called themselves Christians. Now, whether they were Christians, I couldn't always verify. Almost all of those people were churchgoers. Witnesses just move in on them, lay a little academic on them, and they leave. In Brazil, in 1960, there were about 12,000 witnesses. Now there are 750,000 witnesses, all of whom most of whom used to be Christians in one form or another. Most of them Catholic, probably, but many Protestants as well. So why Christianity has abandoned the intellectual defense of the faith is totally beyond me, but I know they have. And it's been my experience in the church for the last 40 years. They just don't devote themselves to the word, unfortunately. I guess it's easy grace, lots of explanations. But let me apologize that next week, boys and girls, the old guy will not be here, because I promised Vinny about a year ago, when he found out he was going to teach the book of James, promised him I'd be there. So there will be no one here to interrupt John's excellent teaching, except some of the more extroverted among you. And I apologize, everybody. I'm such a good
No, that's fine. Yes.
Would you say that the church didn't recognize that there was spiritual warfare going on?
Yeah.
And it's comparable to our constitutional republic today, which is under attack, and which we're losing also because people are not stepping forward.
Yes, the whole mindset's very pervasive, and it goes into politics. And so they even have an evolutionary view of how you should interpret law. And I forget the name of the guy that taught it or whatever, that wrote it up, that is now the way most judges interpret the Constitution. And that is, you interpret the Constitution based upon society today and not the original framer's intent, which is dangerous because it itself says in Article 5, this is how you amend it. You don't reinterpret it. They say, no, you reinterpret it. By the way, this same mentality is what people like John Dominic Crossan do when they look at the Bible. They reinterpret it. They don't look at it as it was meant to be by the original authors to the original audiences. And so that's why we have this big chasm of all these different denominations and stuff like this, because everybody's like, so I can, if it's just faith is just a personal matter, then I can look at this and I can interpret it any way I want. So come along, Joseph Smith, Mr. Russell. They come along and then they come up and they start their own interpretations. And now we have lots and lots and lots of non-Orthodox people that would call themselves Christians, because if you ask a Mormon, they're going to say that they're Christian. But they're not Orthodox. So how do we, again, the Bible is full of this. 1 Peter, James, we're supposed to defend the faith. We're supposed to make an answer with gentleness and respect. We are supposed to, under that passage about spiritual warfare, we're supposed to demolish arguments. That's a very key phrase. When he talks about spiritual warfare, his way of dealing with it is, we're not fighting men on a battlefield, we're demolishing arguments. This is key, because most people, when they think of spiritual warfare, they think of exorcisms. When he talks about it, in the same passage, he says, we're demolishing arguments. We're not demolishing arguments. Well, we're starting to, and that's good. People like Hank Hanegraaff and others, Greg Kokel is very influential these days in apologetics and stuff like that, and he's doing a great job. And there's tons of them. There's a whole, and it goes back to C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer. All of them were confronting this as well. The problem is you'd have Francis Schaeffer doing it and C.S. Lewis doing it in their day, and not a whole lot of other people around them getting involved in it. Today, in fact, they didn't even have degrees on apologetics in any of the schools until within, the last decade or so.
That explains it.
There just wasn't. It existed, but it was like one course that you would take over here, maybe. And most pastors have not taken any courses on apologetics. They take a lot of courses, 96 hours of college unit hours of stuff just to get a Master's of Divinity, and never once was apologetics required in any of those studies.
Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah, so unfortunately, then you end up with like the Presbyterian Church, where they can have this big, huge split because nobody knows how to make a good argument for their case. So it's important that we do these things. I hope that we've at least talked about why this is important and why we have to study that. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening, and thank you for bringing us here to class. Please help us to think about these things as we go through the week, and give us opportunities to start investigating this and being able to talk to others about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.